Hey everyone! Exciting times in Destiny 2 this past week with the addition of the Spire of the Watcher dungeon. With the dungeon comes 6 new-ish weapons, armor, a new exotic weapon, and also no shortage of opinions. If you follow Destiny topics at all on Twitter or other social media platforms, you are aware of some of this community feedback. Aside from just being extremely critical, like others have, I want to share my feedback on the dungeon more holistically and from several perspectives. I'll include a spoiler warning here, as I do discuss elements of the dungeon, so if you haven't run it yet and want to know absolutely nothing about it before you hop in, I'll totally understand you closing this video now. If you're still here, I do expect that you have at least some knowledge of the mechanics, since this is not a guide video on how to beat the activity itself. Over the course of my time in the dungeons of Destiny 2, I generally look for 4 primary categories when crafting feedback for this kind of activity: environment, puzzles, combat, and loot. I don't include story or thematic prowess in these criteria simply because, in many cases, the dungeons are not directly tied to the seasons they premiere in and can and have created their own lore to justify their content. I'm going to start with environment because this is probably my most glowing and positive feedback for the dungeon. Bungie's propensity and expertise in world building never ceases to amaze me. The variation in scales, how you traverse between encounters, and the arenas you battle in are always immersive, sized appropriately, and intuitive. I weigh environment heavily and was happy to see Bungie not disappoint here. The Mars setting lends itself to a sense of mystery since we do not and cannot explore there much anymore, and the Spire architecture felt appropriately serif, mechanical, Vex themed. And in today's world of Mars having been gobbled up by the darkness to who knows where, it is always great to come back to a location we have not spent a great deal of time in lately. The Spire itself is relatively unassuming from the exterior, but the way Bungie crafts the experience in entering, climbing, and subsequently descending into the structure reinforces the environment as integral to the experience of the dungeon and affords them ample opportunity to do things that they do well, like the big drops through spaces of the map. Or one of my favorite environmental aspects of the dungeon was how they crafted the movement experience through the Ascent and Akelos boss encounters. Both of these have you jumping around the extremities of the Spire between floating platforms and grates, definitely making you feel cautious as you hang several hundred feet in the air. You might start taking a few more seconds to line up your jumps. I also enjoy how, at times, they make the environment dangerous. A few different areas have arc wires pulsing across openings that can kill you fairly easily. Equally damaging are the exhaust fans that require you to dodge sets of giant spinning blades of doom, certainly in the running to end a solo flawless run or two. Another one of my favorite environment design choices, though, is in the boss room, by having 2 rooms that you need to work through for the encounter. I enjoy a good standard single room boss arena as much as the next person, but there is just something that's a little bit extra about working through different spaces in the same encounter. This is something that comes pretty standard with raid mechanics that I definitely appreciate that they have brought into dungeons. You know, Duality had the Nightmare Realm as the quote second room throughout the dungeon, so I was happy to see a second play space included for the final boss of Spire. Next up is puzzles and the mechanics involved with those. Every dungeon has one, and usually a single puzzle mechanic will show itself in multiple encounters of each. I think this is something else that Bungie does well that, while seeming kind of obvious and redundant, is a great teaching system for all players who go through the activity. Shattered Throne had symbols, Pit of Heresy did too. Prophecy had the moat dunking mechanic, Grasp of Avarice utilized engrams and the Burden of Riches debuff. Duality had the Bell of Conquest teleporting, and now Spire of the Watcher has power and cable management. The repetition of this mechanic, while predictable, felt okay considering it's not a mechanic that translates directly to another one in the game today. Luckily, Bungie did add variation into the mechanic between the yellow and red wires that you need to shoot for a little variety, and combined both puzzle elements together for the final encounter very well. The variation was nice considering the puzzle element itself was fairly basic. If you get past the entrance encounter, you generally know what to do. So adding the red wires that you have to shoot in quick succession was a nice wrinkle to add. Overall, I think the puzzle mechanic was themed appropriately to the dungeon itself and seemed in line with past dungeon mechanics. The only thing I will say is that in the past, some of these mechanics, like Burden of Riches and Grasp of Avarice, or even the Duality Bell teleports, were much less forgiving to the Guardian. With the Burden of Riches system, you had a timer, and if it ran out while you still had the debuff, you died. Some sort of jolt mechanic over time would have been nice if you ran out of the Arctrition buff and still had wires to charge, just to add to the lethality of the mechanic and make it more meaningful to the player. Getting the buff from the Minotaur is relatively easy, and there's no punishment for losing it, other than having to go get it again. And if you are only working on yellow wires, as long as you're shooting each node in order, they all stay active until you complete the full chain. In application, it feels more like busy work than a truly engaging mechanic that you need to monitor and complete with purpose. On to combat. No dungeon would be worth completing if it wasn't challenging, not just mechanically, but from the dangerous enemies that are waiting there for you. From a power standpoint, as of this video launching in Season 19, the recommended power for Spire of the Watcher is 1570, which is the soft cap for this season, with power cap at 1580, pinnacle cap at 1590. That means dungeon enemies start around 1570 power, but scale up to 1590 by the time you reach the final boss. Spire of the Watcher is nice because it was our first Vex-themed dungeon in Destiny 2. While we've been exposed to the gamut of Vex enemy types through the rest of Destiny's activities, it's always interesting to see what combinations and types are thrown at you in a dungeon environment. The combat for this dungeon felt much different from the most recent release before, Duality. Duality was very chaotic, enemy dense, and punishing. Spire of the Watcher was not this for the most part. The entrance encounter and the first actual lootable encounter are remarkably tame and seem to primarily exist solely for the "I'm here to teach you the puzzle" mechanic, with very little risk of life or limb. This did not live up to the expectations for me from a combat perspective. Other than killing the Minotaurs for the Arctrition buff, you can get away with killing almost nothing else. Due to the way the entrance encounter is designed, I actually think the enemies are more lethal there than in the first encounter you actually open a chest from. This seems pretty backwards to me. However, Bungie does make up for it in the first boss encounter, Icalos, the Siren's Current, aka the giant harpy boss from Garden of Salvation, Consecrated Mind. This fight includes generous enemy density, coupled with a continuation of the puzzle mechanic, while also introducing new mechanics to the dungeon in how to initiate and execute a damage phase on the boss. The combat flow for this encounter is solid and will certainly need to be repeated based on how much health the boss has. Now, listen, I completely get why some people might be upset about seeing a character model and certain mechanics in a new activity that they originally experienced 3 years ago. The character model doesn't bother me as much as replicating specific mechanics from the original Consecrated Mind encounter from Garden of Salvation. I would probably curb my critique of that if Garden had already been vaulted, but that raid is still playable today. If I want that same experience, I'll go run the original encounter. From a combat standpoint, if you're familiar with Garden of Salvation, you'll be very familiar with the damage phase of Icalos. As for the character model, I don't feel strongly enough about that to consider a detraction from the rest of the great work on the dungeon or the encounter. There's no reason and very little justification to have every element of a dungeon be completely bespoke. I just don't think that's how this type of game development works. You're going to see familiar enemies, and when it comes to the Vex, I suppose seeing something that looks like the Consecrated Mind certainly invokes a feeling of pinnacle endgame PvE. The rest of my combat comments up until the final boss are fairly brief. The focus is more on environment and the process of traversing back down the spire to get to the final boss. There are repeats of the red wire puzzle mechanic and the inclusion of the environmental decapitation fan blades that I mentioned in that section of the video. Aside from killing things, get buff, shoot nodes, let's skip ahead to the final big baddie, Persis Primordial Ruin. Combat in this encounter just feels right. As is standard for most dungeons, the final boss encounter combines all of the individual instrumental arrangements into a final glorious symphony. Not only are you working with the puzzle mechanics in tandem with navigating the 2 rooms of the boss arena, but you also have a truly wicked collection of enemies. The combat mechanics of this encounter are just chaotic. The mechanics themselves are not so different from the past encounters. You are still working with yellow and red wires. You still need to kill minotaurs to pick up the Arctrician buff, but you now also have supplicants chasing toward you, and the biggest frickin' space chicken in Destiny in the form of the boss Persis, who also aggressively follows you from room to room. Beyond that, you now also have a new enemy type, the Incarcerator Hydra, that you need to kill to progress the rest of the encounter at all. Bungie really cranks up the intensity here, worthy of any boss fight in the game. This is where combatants do become a problem while you are working to connect the wires and get to a damage phase. The enemy density seems appropriately balanced, especially at release, with the majority of players attempting the day 1 dungeon are probably 5 to 10 power levels under the 1590 recommendation for the final encounter. Granted, as we go further into the season and beyond, things will feel a little easier because of power. The combat of the final encounter, though, does feel like Bungie is respecting the player's effort and time. Excellent job to the team who worked that out. Which brings us to the why of this entire conversation. Why run the dungeon at all? Aside from the experience itself, we all expect to be rewarded appropriately after dispatching these enemies, right? Right? I started this review with glowing praise for Bungie's environmental design, which unfortunately means I have to end on a frustratingly tepid note regarding the loot of this dungeon. At the time of the writing of this video, the Bungie API is still down, so I can't go into detail on all of the possible roles of these weapons, so I will speak a little more broadly on the topic. There is plenty to say. One of the strongest public opinions on this dungeon so far is the loot. And rightfully so. People are excited for the new things dropping with Spire, including a whole new set of Yeehaw Tex Mechanica armor and 4 new Tex Mechanica weapons. And I've heard that the sidearm can roll with some great perks, as well as the new Arc Scout Rifle long arm, which seems like the legendary equivalent to Dead Man's Tail, that can roll with combinations like rapid hit and explosive payload. The prospect of a new exotic bow is also intriguing, especially from what I've seen online about how that works. But the most confusing part of the loot to this dungeon is the reintroduction of 2 weapons in particular, the 7th Seraph Carbine and the 7th Seraph Officer Revolver. This, I feel, is an issue of the Destiny community developing their own expectations based on a previous experience, and then expecting the same exact formula next time, without the developer of the game stating as such. Let me explain. The last dungeon release was Duality. It too released 4 brand new weapons, a new exotic, and reprised 2 previously sunset Season of Opulence weapons, the Fixed Odds Machine Gun and the Epicurean Fusion Rifle. Feel how you will about reprised content, but I think Bungie had a case for these 2 opulence weapons for 2 very specific reasons. 1, they were sunset. Neither Fixed Odds or the Epicurean were accessible in the game by any other means. They were unobtainable until their reintroduction via Duality. And then the second reason, they were made craftable as part of their reprisal. Meaning even if you had a pretty good roll from way back when, sitting in your vault being useless, you could now grind for new rolls, new perk combinations, and get them with enhanced perks. Once people took note of this, the community kind of assumed that this would repeat itself in the second dungeon to be released during the Witch Queen expansion. Enter Spire of the Watcher, 7th Seraph weapons. And for the 2 reasons I just listed as positives for the Opulence weapon's reintroduction in Duality, this weapon release completely ignored that. Neither of the 7th Seraph Carbine or the Revolver were sunset. Both of those weapons, up until the release of Spire of the Watcher, had been available as part of the loot pool in Dares of Eternity. And to compound the problem, neither of these weapons is craftable. Albeit these weapons did appear to get new perk combinations. When the API is available again, I'm sure we'll be hunting for anything worthwhile on these two guns to try and justify the move by Bungie to release them the way they did. But so far, they do not appear to be craftable. It's also just 7th Seraph in general. When these weapons first released, their primary point of use was to generate Warmind cells. The guns themselves could get some decent perks, but very little that would have you choose them over another weapon of the same type, comparing perks alone. The whole point of their use was to generate those glowing orange balls of absolute destruction that you could take advantage of with your Warmind cell combat style armor mods. And since the nerfing of Warmind cells, I think the general appeal for Seraph and Ikelos weapons has dropped significantly. So now we get two weapons with very low community desire to obtain, now seemingly muddying up the loot pool and are currently viewed as more of a barrier to getting the loot you want than an actual reason to grind the dungeon. I know, not a great way to close out my feedback, but I know it's something important to the community. And to be honest, there is so much other fun to be had in this dungeon. The boss encounter is enough for me to overlook a less than ideal loot pool combined with a solid environment design, combat, and puzzle mechanics. After running it a few times, I do still feel like it's generally easier than past dungeons, but I still don't know if that's a pro or a con. I think this is why a lot of the community sentiment is also fairly split. For a fire team, it may seem like a breeze. For solo players, I think it will be balanced really well to provide a solid challenge that respects the history behind that accomplishment. Overall, I think Spire of the Watcher is a solid experience worth running. The fun factor is there for me, and I'm sure it will be for you too. Thanks for watching, and I will see you all next time.